fruition. Verse 201, victory breeds hatred. Victory breeds hatred. The defeated live in pain. The peaceful live happily, having renounced conquest and defeat. Story related to Dhammapada. Verse 201, defeat of the king of Kosala. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 201 with reference to the king of Kosala, who was defeated in battle by Ajatasattu, his own nephew. In fighting against Ajatasattu, the king of Kosala was defeated 3 times. Ajatasattu was the son of King Bimbisara and Queen Vaidehi, the sister of the king of Kosala. The king of Kosala was ashamed and very much depressed over his defeat. Thus his lamentation, "What a disgrace! I cannot even conquer this boy who still smells of mother's milk. It is better that I should die." Feeling depressed and very much ashamed, the king refused to take food, and kept to his bed. The news about the king's distress spread like wildfire, and when the Buddha came to learn about it, he said, "Bhikkhus, in one who conquers, enmity and hatred increase, one who is defeated suffers pain and distress." In other words, the Buddha commented on the evil consequences of both defeat and victory, uttering the above verse. Verse 202, lust is a fire like no other. There is no fire like lust, no crime like hate. There is no ill like the body, no bliss higher than peace, nibbana. Story related to Dhammapada. Verse 202, young bride. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 202 at the house of a lay disciple, with reference to a young bride. On the day a young woman was to be wedded to a young man, the parents of the bride invited the Buddha and 80 of his disciples for alms food. Seeing the girl as she moved about the house, helping with the offering of alms food, the bridegroom was very much excited by lust, and he could hardly attend to the needs of the Buddha and the other bhikkhus. The Buddha knew exactly how the young bridegroom was feeling, and also that time was ripe for both the bride and the bridegroom to attain Sotapaddi fruition. By his supernormal power, the Buddha willed that the bride would not be visible to the bridegroom. When the young man could no longer see the young woman, he could pay full attention to the Buddha, and his love and respect for the Buddha grew stronger in him. Then the Buddha said to the young man, "O young man, there is no fire like the fire of passion. There is no evil like anger and hatred. There is no ill like the burden of the five aggregates of existence, khandhas. There is no bliss like the perfect peace of nibbana." Verse 203. Hunger is the greatest disease. Hunger is the greatest disease. Aggregates are the greatest ill. Knowing this as it really is, the wise realize nibbana, bliss supreme. Story related to Dhammapada verse 203, lay disciple. The Buddha uttered verse 203 at the village of Alavi, with reference to a lay disciple. One day, the Buddha saw in his vision that a poor man would attain Sotapaddy fruition at the village of Alavi. So he went to that village, which was 30 yojanas away from Savatthi. It so happened that on that very day the man lost his ox. So, he had to be looking for the ox. Meanwhile, alms food was being offered to the Buddha and his disciples in a house in the village of Alavi. After the meal, people got ready to listen to the Buddha's discourse, but the Buddha waited for the young man. Finally, having found his ox, the man came running to the house where the Buddha was. The man was tired and hungry, so the Buddha directed the donors to offer food to him. Only when the man had been fed, the Buddha gave a discourse, expounding the Dhamma step by step and finally leading to the Four Noble Truths. The lay disciple attained Sotapaddy fruition at the end of the discourse. Afterwards, the Buddha and his disciples returned to the Jetavana monastery. On the way, the bhikkhus remarked that it was so surprising that the Buddha should have directed those people to feed the young man before he gave the discourse. On hearing their remarks, the Buddha said, "Bhikkhus, what you said is true, but you do not understand that I have come here, all this distance of 30 yojanas, because I knew that he was in a fitting condition to take in the Dhamma. If he were feeling very hungry, the pangs of hunger might have prevented him from taking in the Dhamma fully. That man had been out looking for his ox the whole morning, and was very tired and also very hungry. Bhikkhus, after all, there is no ailment which is so difficult to bear as hunger." Verse 204. Health is paramount. Health is the highest gain. Contentment is the greatest wealth. The trustworthy are the best kinsmen. Nibbana is the highest bliss. Story related to Dhammapada verse 204. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 204 with reference to King Pasenadi of Kosala. One day, King Pasenadi of Kosala went to the Jetavana monastery after having his full morning meal. It was said that the king had eaten 1/4 basket, about half a bushel, of rice with meat curry on that day, so while listening to the Buddha's discourse he felt very sleepy and was nodding most of the time. Seeing him nodding, the Buddha advised him to take a little less rice every day and to decrease the amount on a sliding scale to the minimum of 1/16th part of the original amount he was taking. The king did as he was told and found that by eating less he became thin, but he felt very much lighter and enjoyed much better health. When he told the Buddha about this, the Buddha said to him, "O king, health is a great boon, contentment is a great wealth. Wealth, a close and trusted friend is the best relative. Nibbana is the greatest bliss." Verse 205 Who tastes the Dhamma is sorrowless. Having tasted the flavor of seclusion and appeasement, he becomes free from sorrow and stain. One enjoys the rapturous flavor of the Dhamma. Story related to Dhammapada verse 205, Theratissa. The Buddha uttered verse 205 with reference to Theratissa. When the Buddha declared that in 4 months' time he would realize parinibbana, many Puthajjana bhikkhus were apprehensive. They were at a loss and did not know what to do, and so they kept close to the Buddha. But Theratissa, having resolved that he would attain arahatship in the lifetime of the Buddha, did not go to him, but left for a secluded place to practice meditation. Other bhikkhus, not understanding his behavior, took him to the Buddha and said, "Venerable Sir, this bhikkhu does not seem to cherish and honor you. He only keeps to himself instead of coming to your presence." Theratissa then explained to them that he was striving hard to attain arahatship before the Buddha realized parinibbana, and that was the only reason why he had not come to see the Buddha. Having heard his explanation, the Buddha said to the bhikkhus, "Bhikkhus, those who love and respect me should act like Tissa. You are not paying homage to me by just offering me flowers, perfumes, and incense. You pay homage to me only by practicing the Lokuttara Dhamma, i.e., insight meditation." Verse 206 to 208 Pleasant meetings, happy company, the good and the wise. Blessed is the sight of the noble ones, their company is ever happy. Not seeing fools is also always a pleasure. He who walks in the company of fools has to grieve for a long time. Association with fools is ever painful, as living with an enemy. Association with the wise is a pleasure, as living with relatives. Therefore, with the intelligent, the wise, the learned, the enduring, the dutiful, and the noble ones, with a man of such virtue and intellect should one associate, as the moon follows the starry path. Story related to Dhammapada verse 206 to 208, Saka. While residing at the village of Veluva, the Buddha uttered verses 206, 207, and 208 of this book, with reference to Saka, king of the Devas. About 10 months before the Buddha realized parinibbana, the Buddha was spending the Vasa at Veluva village near Visali. While he was staying there, he suffered from dysentery. When Saka learned that the Buddha was ailing, he came to Veluva village so that he could personally nurse the Buddha during his sickness. The Buddha told him not to worry about his health as there were many bhikkhus near him, but Saka did not listen to him and kept on nursing the Buddha until he recovered. The bhikkhus were surprised and awestruck to find Saka himself attending on the Buddha. When the Buddha heard their remarks, he said, "Bhikkhus, there is nothing surprising about Saka's love and devotion to me. Once, when the former Saka was growing old and was about to pass away, he came to see me. Then I expounded the Dhamma to him. While listening to the Dhamma, he attained Sotapaddy fruition, then he passed away and was reborn as the present Saka. All these happened to him simply because he listened to the Dhamma expounded by me. Indeed, Bhikkhus, it is good to see the noble ones, Aryas. It is a pleasure to live with them. To live with fools is, indeed, painful." Dhammapada chapter 16 verse 209 to 220, Affection. Verse 209,210,211, Hold nothing dear, give up affection. He who does what should not be done and fails to do what should be done, who forsakes the noble aim of life and grasps at sensual pleasure, covets the benefits gained by those who exert themselves. Don't associate with the dear, and never with the undear. Not seeing those who are dear is painful, as is seeing those who are not dear. Therefore, one should hold nothing dear. Separation from the loved ones is painful. There are no fetters for those who do not love or hate. Story related to Dhammapada verse 209,210,211, Three Ascetics. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 209, 210 and 211 with reference to a trio, consisting of a father, a mother and a son. Once in Savatthi, the only son of a family first became a bhikkhu, the father followed suit and finally, the mother also became a bhikkhuni. They were so attached to one another that they rarely stayed apart. The family stayed in the monastery as if they were in their own house, talking and eating together, thus making themselves a nuisance to others. Other bhikkhus reported their behavior to the Buddha, and he called them to his presence, and said to them, "Once you have joined the order, you should no longer stay together like a family. Not seeing those who are dear, and seeing those who are not dear to one, are both painful, so you should not hold any being or anything dear to you." In other words, to be separated with loved ones is suffering, and to be with unloved is suffering. Thus one should abandon attachments and hold nothing dear. Verse 212, the outcome of endearment. Affection begets sorrow, affection begets fear. For him who is free from affection, there is no sorrow. How can there be fear for him? Story related to Dhammapada verse 212, rich householder. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 212 with reference to a rich householder who had lost his son. Once, a householder was feeling very distressed over the death of his son. He often went to the cemetery and wept there. Early one morning, the Buddha saw the rich householder in his vision. So, taking a bhikkhu along with him, the Buddha went to the house of that man. There, he asked the man why he was feeling so unhappy. Then, the man related to the Buddha about the death of his son and about the pain and sorrow he was suffering. To him the Buddha said, "My disciple, death does not occur only in one place. All beings that are born must die one day. Indeed, life ends in death. You must ever be mindful of the fact that life ends in death. Do not imagine that only your beloved son is subject to death. Do not be so distressed or be so shaken. Sorrow and fear arise out of affection." Verse 213, from affection springs grief. From affection springs grief, from affection springs fear. For him who is wholly free from affection, there is no grief, whence fear. Story related to Dhammapada verse 213, Visakha. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 213 with reference to Visakha, the renowned donor of the Pabarama monastery. One day, a granddaughter of Visakha named Sudatta died, and Visakha felt very deeply about her loss and was sorrowing over the child's death. So she went to the Buddha. When the Buddha saw her, he said, "Visakha, don't you realize that many people die in Savatthi every day? If you were to regard all of them as you regard your own grandchild, you would have to be endlessly weeping and mourning. Let not the death of a child affect you too much." Sorrow and fear arise out of endearment. Verse 214, from passion springs grief. From passion springs grief, from passion springs fear, for him who is wholly free from passion, there is no grief, much less fear. Story related to Dhammapada verse 214, Lichavi princes. While residing at the Kutagra Monastery in Vaisali, the Buddha uttered verse 214 with reference to the Lichavi princes. On one festival day, the Buddha entered the town of Vaisali, accompanied by a retinue of bhikkhus. On their way, they met some Lichavi princes, who had come out elegantly dressed up. The Buddha, seeing them in full regalia, said to the bhikkhus, "Bhikkhus, those who have not been to the Tavatimsadeva world should have a good look at these Lichavi princes." The princes were then on their way to a pleasure garden. There, they quarreled over a prostitute and soon came to blows. As a result, some of them had to be carried home, bleeding. As the Buddha returned with the bhikkhus after his meal in the town, they saw the wounded princes being carried home. In connection with the above incident, the bhikkhus remarked, "For the sake of a woman, these Lichavi princes are ruined." To them the Buddha replied, "Bhikkhus, sorrow and fear arise out of enjoyment of sensual pleasures and attachment to them." Verse 215 From lust springs grief. From lust springs grief, from lust springs fear, for him who is holy. Free from lust there is no grief, whence fear? Story related to Dhammapada verse 215, Anitthaganda Kumara. While residing at the Jetavana Monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 215 with reference to a youth named Anitthaganda. Anitthaganda lived in Savatthi. He was to marry a beautiful young girl from the city of Sagala, in the country of the Maddas. As the bride was coming from her home to Savatthi, she became ill and died on the way. When the bridegroom learned about the tragic death of his bride, he was broken-hearted. At this juncture, the Buddha, knowing that time was ripe for the young man to attain Sotapaddi fruition, went to his house. The parents of the young man offered alms food to the Buddha. After the meal, the Buddha asked his parents to bring the young man to his presence. When he came, the Buddha asked him why he was in such pain and distress, and the young man related the whole story of the tragic death of his young bride. Then the Buddha said to him, "O Anitthaganda, lust begets sorrow. It is due to lust for things and lust for sensual pleasures that sorrow and fear arise." Verse 216 From craving springs grief. From craving springs grief, from craving springs fear, for him who is wholly free from craving there is no grief, whence fear? Story related to Dhammapada verse 216, Brahman. While residing at the Jetavana Monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 216 with reference to a Brahman who was a farmer. The Brahman lived in Savatthi, and he was a non-Buddhist. But the Buddha knew that the Brahman would attain Sotapaddi fruition in the near future. So the Buddha went to where the Brahman was plowing his field and talked to him. The Brahman became friendly and was thankful to the Buddha for taking an interest in him and his work in the field. One day, he said to the Buddha, "Samama Gautama, when I have gathered my rice from this field, I will first offer you some before I take it. I will not eat my rice until I have given you some. However, The Buddha knew beforehand that the Brahmin would not have the opportunity to harvest the rice from his field that year, but he kept silent. Then, on the night before the Brahmin was to harvest his rice, there was a heavy downpour of rain which washed away the entire crop of rice. The Brahmin was very much distressed, because he would no longer be able to offer any rice to his friend, the Samamagatama. The Buddha went to the house of the Brahmin, and the Brahmin talked to him about the great disaster that had befallen him. In reply, the Buddha said, "Brahmin, you do not know the cause of sorrow, but I know. If sorrow and fear arise, they arise because of craving." Verse 217, the virtuous are dear to all. Whoever is perfect in virtue and insight, established in the Dhamma, has realized the truths, and fulfilled his duties, people hold him dear. Story related to Dhammapada verse 217. While residing at the Velluvana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 217 with reference to 500 boys. On one festival day, the Buddha entered the city of Rajagaha for alms food, accompanied by a number of bhikkhus. On their way, they met 500 boys going to a pleasure garden. The boys were carrying some baskets of pancakes, but they did not offer anything to the Buddha and his bhikkhus. But the Buddha said to his bhikkhus, "Bhikkhus, you shall eat those pancakes today. The owner is coming close behind us. We shall proceed only after taking some of these pancakes." After saying this, the Buddha and his bhikkhus rested under the shade of a tree. Just at that moment Thera came along, and the boys seeing him paid obeisance to him and offered all their pancakes to the Thera. The Thera then told the boys, "My teacher the Exalted One is resting underneath a tree over there accompanied by some bhikkhus. Go and make an offering of your pancakes to him and the bhikkhus." The boys did as they were told. The Buddha accepted their offering of pancakes. Later, when the bhikkhus remarked that the boys were very partial to Thera, the Buddha said to them, "Bhikkhus, all bhikkhus who are like my son Kassapa are liked by both devas and men. Such bhikkhus always receive ample offerings of the 4 requisites of bhikkhus." At the end of the discourse, the 500 boys attained Sotapaddy fruition. In other words, one who is virtuous are dear to all. Verse 218, the unattached are bound upstream. He who has developed a desire for the ineffable, i.e., nibbana, whose mind reaches the same, and is no longer attached to the sensual world, kamaloka, is called one who is bound upstream, uttam soto. Story related to Dhammapada verse 218, Anagami Thera. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 218 with reference to a Thera who was an anagami, non-returner. On one occasion, The pupils of the Thera asked him whether he had attained any of the Mag-gas stages of enlightenment, but he did not say anything, although he had attained the Anagami Magga, the third Magga, non-returner. He kept silent because he had resolved not to talk about his attainment until he had attained arahatship. But the Thera passed away without attaining arahatship, and also without saying anything about his attainment of Anagami Magga insight. His pupils thought their teacher had passed away without attaining any of the Mag-gas, and they felt sorry for him. They went to the Buddha and asked him where their teacher was reborn. The Buddha replied, Bhikkhus, your teacher, who was an Anagami before he passed away, is now reborn in the abodes of the Brahmas, Suttavesa Brahmaloka. He did not reveal his attainment of Anagami Magga, because he felt ashamed that he had achieved only that much, and he was ardently striving to attain arahatship. Your teacher is now freed from the attachment to the sensual world, Kamaloka, and would certainly rise to higher realms. In other words, one who is no longer attached to sensual pleasures, with a desire for nibbana, will be bound for the upstream. Verse 219 to 220, good actions lead to good results. A man long absent and returned safe from afar, his relatives, friends, and well-wishers welcome on his arrival. Similarly, good deeds will welcome the doer of good who has left this world for the next, like how relatives welcome a dear relative on his return. Story related to Dhammapada verse 219 to 220, Nandiya. While residing at the Isapatana wood, the Buddha uttered verses 219 and 220 with reference to Nandiya. Nandiya was a rich man from Varanasi. After listening to the Buddha's discourse on the benefits of building monasteries for bhikkhus, Nandiya built the Mahavihara monastery at Isapatana. The building was pinnacled and fully furnished. As soon as the monastery was offered to the Buddha, a mansion came up for Nandiya at the Tavatimsadeva world. One day, when Thera Mahamoggalana visited the Tavatimsadeva world, he saw the mansion, which was meant for the donor of the Mahavihara monastery at Isapatana. On his return from the Tavatimsadeva world, Thera Mahamoggalana asked the Buddha, Venerable Sir, for those who perform meritorious deeds, do they have mansions and other riches prepared in the Deva world even while they are still living in this world? To him the Buddha said, My son, why do you ask? Have you not yourself seen the mansion and riches waiting for Nandiya in the Tavatimsadeva world? The Devas await the coming of the good and generous ones, as relatives await the return of one who is long absent. When the good ones die, they are welcomed joyously to the abode of the Devas. In other words, when one does meritorious good deeds, one will have good returns. Dhammapada chapter 17 verse 221 to 234, Anger. Verse 221, Give up anger. Give up anger, abandon conceit, overcome all fetters. Ills never befall him who clings not to the mind and body and is passionless. Story related to Dhammapada verse 221, Rohinakadiyakana Vathu. While residing at the Nigrodharma monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 221 with reference to Princess Rohini, sister of Thera Anuruddha. On one occasion, Thera Anuruddha visited Kapilavatthu. While he was staying at the monastery there, all his relatives, with the exception of his sister Rohini, came to see him. On learning from them that Rohini did not come because she was suffering from leprosy, he sent for her. Covering her head in shame, Rohini came when she was sent for. Thera Anuruddha told her to do some meritorious deed, and he suggested that she should sell some of her clothing and jewelry, and with the money raised, to build a refectory for the bhikkhu. Rohini agreed to do as she was told. Thera Anuruddha also asked his other relatives to help in the construction of the hall. Further, he told Rohini to sweep the floor and fill the water pots every day even while the construction was still going on. She did as she was instructed and she began to get better. When the hall was completed, the Buddha and his bhikkhus were invited for alms food. After the meal, the Buddha asked for the donor of the building and alms food, but Rohini was not there. So the Buddha sent for her and she came. The Buddha asked her whether she knew why she was inflicted with this dreaded disease, and she answered that she did not know. So the Buddha told her that she had the dreadful disease because of an evil deed she had done out of spite and anger in one of her past existences. As explained by the Buddha, Rohini was, at one time, the chief queen of the king of Varanasi. It so happened that the king had a favorite dancer and the chief queen was very jealous of her. So the queen wanted to punish the dancer. Thus one day, she had her attendants put some itching powder made from cowhage pods in the dancer's bed, her blankets, etc. Next, they called the dancer, and as though in jest, they threw some itching powder on her. The girl itched all over and was in great pain and discomfort. Thus itching unbearably, she ran to her room and her bed, which made her suffer even more. As a result of that evil deed, Rohini had become a leper in this existence. The Buddha then exhorted the congregation not to act foolishly in anger and not to bear any ill will towards others. In other words, it will be beneficial to one who gives up anger, conceit, and overcomes all fetters. Verse 222, the true charioteer. Whoever checks his uprisen anger as though it were a rolling chariot, I call a true charioteer. Others merely hold the reins. Story related to Dhammapada verse 222, Bhikkhu. While residing at the Agalava stupa in the city of Alavi, the Buddha uttered verse 222 with reference to a bhikkhu. Once, a bhikkhu from Alavi wanted to build a monastery for himself, and so he began to cut down a tree. The deva dwelling in that tree, Rukkadevata, tried to stop him, saying that she and her infant son had nowhere to go. Failing to stop the bhikkhu, she put her son on a branch, hoping that it would stop him from felling the tree. By then, the bhikkhu was already swinging his axe, and he could not stop it in time and unintentionally cut off an arm of the child. Seeing her child being harmed in this way, the mother flew in a rage and was about to kill the bhikkhu. As she raised her hands to strike the bhikkhu, she suddenly checked herself and thought, if I were to kill a bhikkhu, I would be killing one who observes the moral precepts, sila. In that case, I would surely suffer in niraya. Other guardian devas of the trees would be following my example, and other bhikkhus would also be killed. But this bhikkhu has a master, I must go and see his master. So she went weeping to the Buddha and related all that had happened. To her the Buddha said, O Rukkadevata, you have done well to control yourself. In other words, one who checks his uprising anger is a true charioteer. Verse 223, conquer anger by love. Conquer anger by love. Conquer evil by good. Conquer the stingy by giving. Conquer the liar by truth. Story related to Dhammapada verse 223, Uttara, the lay disciple. While residing at the Velluvana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 223 with reference to Uttara, a female lay disciple. Uttara was the daughter of a farm laborer named Punna and his wife. Punna worked for a rich man named Sumana in Rajagaha. One day, Punna and his wife offered alms food to Tharasariputta soon after his arising from sustained deep mental absorption, Nirodha Samapatti, and as a result of that good deed they suddenly became very rich. Punna came upon gold in the field he was plowing, and the king officially declared him a royal banker. On one occasion, the family of Punna offered alms food to the Buddha and the bhikkhus for 7 days. And on the 7th day, after hearing the Buddha's discourse, all the 3 members of the family attained Sotapaddi fruition. Later, Uttara, the daughter of Punna, married the son of the rich man Sumana. That family being non-Buddhist, Uttara did not feel happy in her husband's home. So, she told her father, My father, why have you put me in this cage? Here, I do not see any bhikkhu, and I have no chance to offer anything to any bhikkhu. Her father felt sorry for her and sent her 15,000 in cash. With this money, after getting permission from her husband, Uttara engaged a courtesan to look to the needs of her husband. So it was arranged that Sirima, a well-known and very beautiful courtesan, was to take her place as a wife for 15 days. During that time, Uttara offered alms food to the Buddha and the bhikkhus. On the 15th day, as she was busy preparing food in the kitchen, her husband saw her from the bedroom window and smiled, and then muttered to himself, How foolish she is! She does not know how to enjoy herself. She is tiring herself out with this alms-giving ceremony. Sirima saw him smile, and forgetting that she was only a paid substitute wife, felt very jealous of Uttara. Being unable to control herself, Sirima went into the kitchen and got a ladleful of boiling butter with the intention of pouring it over the head of Uttara. Uthara saw her coming, but she bore no ill will towards Sarama. She reflected that because Sirama had stood in for her, she had been able to listen to the Dhamma, make offerings of alms food for 15 days, and perform other acts of charity. Thus she was quite thankful to Sirama. Suddenly, she realized that Sirama had come very close to her and was going to pour boiling hot butter over her, so she made this asseveration: "If I bear any ill will towards Sirama, may this boiling hot butter burn me. If I have no ill will towards her, may it not burn me." As Uthara had no ill will towards Sirama, the boiling butter poured over her head by Sirama was just like cold water. Then Sirama thought the butter must have gone cold, and as she went for another ladleful of boiling butter, the attendants of Uthara fell upon her and beat her hard. Uthara stopped her attendants and instructed them to rub Sirama with medicinal ointment. Then, Sirama remembered her true position, and she regretted that she had done wrong to Uthara and asked Uthara to forgive her. To her Uthara replied, "I have my father, I shall ask him whether I should accept your apology." Sirama then said that she would readily go and apologize to the rich man, the father of Uthara. Uthara then explained to Sirama, "Sirama, when I said my father, I did not mean my real father, who had brought me into this round of rebirths. I was referring to my father, the Buddha, who had helped me break the chain of rebirths, who had taught me the Dhamma, the noble truths." Sirama then expressed her wish to see the Buddha. So it was arranged that Sirama should offer alms food to the Buddha and the bhikkhus offer alms food to the Buddha and the bhikkhus on the following day at the house of Uthara. After the meal, the Buddha was told everything that had happened between Sirama and Uthara. Sirama then owned up that she had done wrong to Uthara and entreated the Buddha that she should be forgiven, for otherwise Uthara would not forgive her. The Buddha then asked Uthara how she felt in her mind when Sirama poured boiling butter on her head, and Uthara answered, "Venerable Sir, because I owed so much to Sirama, I had resolved not to lose my temper, not to bear any ill will towards her. I sent forth my love towards her." The Buddha then said, well done, Uthara. By not bearing any ill will, you have been able to conquer one who has done you wrong through hate. By not abusing, you should conquer one who abuses you. By being generous, you should conquer one who is stingy. By speaking the truth, you should conquer one who tells lies. Verse 224. Be truthful, patient, and generous. One should speak the truth. One should not be angry. Give your mite to those who ask for alms. By these three ways, one may go to the presence of the gods. Story related to Dhammapada verse 224, question raised by Thera Mahamoggallana. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 224 with reference to the question raised by Thera Mahamoggallana. Once, Thera Mahamoggallana visited the Deva world and found many devas living in luxurious mansions. He asked them for what good deed they were reborn in the Deva world, and they gave him different answers. One of them was reborn in the Deva world not because he gave away much wealth in charity, or because he had listened to the Dhamma, but just because he always spoke the truth. The second one was a female Deva who was reborn in the Deva world because she did not get angry with her master and had no ill will towards him, even though he often beat her and abused her. For keeping her temper and abandoning hatred, she was reborn in the Deva world. Then, there were others who were reborn in the Deva world because they had offered little things like a stick of sugar cane, a fruit, or some vegetables, to a bhikkhu or to someone else. On his return from the Deva world, Thera Mahamoggallana asked the Buddha whether it was possible to gain such great benefits by just speaking the truth, or by restraining one's actions, or by giving small amounts of such trifling things like fruits and vegetables. To him the Buddha answered, "My son, why do you ask? Have you not seen for yourself and heard what the Devas said? You should not have any doubt. Little deeds of merit surely lead one to the world of the Devas. In other words, if one is truthful, patient and generous in charity, then one will get good returns." Verse 225, the harmless attain the deathless. The arahants, who do not harm others and are always restrained in their actions, go to the deathless nibbana, where there is no sorrow. Story related to Dhammapada verse 225, Brahman who had been the father of the Buddha. While residing at the Anjana wood, near Saketa, the Buddha uttered verse 225 with reference to a Brahmin who claimed that the Buddha was his son. Once, the Buddha accompanied by some bhikkhus entered the town of Saketa for alms food. The old Brahmin, seeing the Buddha, went to him and said, "O son, why have you not allowed us to see you all this long time? Come with me, and let your mother also see you." So saying, he invited the Buddha to his house. On reaching the house, the wife of the Brahmin said the same things to the Buddha and introduced the Buddha as your big brother to her children, and made them pay obeisance to him. From that day, the couple offered alms food to the Buddha every day. And having heard the religious discourses, both the Brahmin and his wife attained anagami fruition in due course. The bhikkhus were puzzled why the Brahmin couple said the Buddha was their son, so they asked the Buddha. The Buddha then replied, Bhikkhus, they called me son because I was a son or a nephew to each of them for 1,500 existences in the past. The Buddha continued to stay there, near the Brahmin couple for 3 more months, and during that time, both the Brahmin and his wife attained arahantship, and then realized parinibbana. The Bhikkhus, not knowing that the Brahmin couple had already become arahats, asked the Buddha where they were reborn. To them the Buddha answered, those who have become arahats are not reborn anywhere, they have realized nibbana. Verse 226, the diligent destroy defilements. They come to the end of their defilements, asavas, those who keep awake, who study day and night, and who are intent on nirvana. Story related to Dhammapada verse 226, Punna, the slave girl. While residing at the Gijjakuta mountain, the Buddha uttered verse 226 with reference to a slave girl in Rajagaha. One night, Punna the slave girl was up pounding rice for her master. As she got tired, she rested for a while. While resting, she saw Theradabba leading some bhikkhus to their respective monasteries on their return from listening to the Dhamma. The girl, seeing them up so late, pondered, I have to be up at this late hour, because I am so poor and have to work hard. But, why are these good people up at this late hour? Maybe a bhikkhu is sick, or are they being troubled by a snake? Early in the morning the next day, Punna took some broken rice, soaked it in water and made a pancake out of it. Then, intending to eat it at the riverside, she took her cheap, coarse pancake along with her. On the way, she saw the Buddha coming on an alms round. She wanted to offer her pancake to the Buddha, but she was not sure whether the Buddha would condescend to eat such cheap, coarse pancake. The Buddha knew her thoughts. He accepted her pancake and asked Therananda to spread the small mat on the ground. The Buddha sat on the mat and ate the pancake offered by the slave girl. After eating, the Buddha called Punna to him and answered the question which was troubling her. Said the Buddha to the slave girl, Punna, you cannot go to sleep, because you are poor and so have to work hard. As for my disciples, the bhikkhus, they do not go to sleep, because they have to be always vigilant and ever mindful. In other words, those who destroyed their defilements strive hard day and night to attain nibbana. Verse 227 to 230, no one avoids blame in this world. It is not new, O Achala. It has always been done from ancient times. They blame one who is silent, they blame one who speaks much, they blame one who speaks little. There is no one in this world who is not blamed. There never has been, there never will be, nor is there now, anyone who is always blamed or always praised. If the wise praise him day after day, knowing him to be truly faultless, wise, and endowed with knowledge and virtue, who would blame him, who is like a nika of pure gold? The devas praise him, he is praised even by the great Brahmas. Story related to Venerable Sir, we have come to listen to your teaching. We have been to other teachers before we come here, but we are not satisfied with any of them. Theravada did not bother to teach us, and he just kept silent. Sariputta was too exhaustive, and the Dhamma he taught us was too difficult for us. As for Therananda, he was too brief and too sketchy. We do not like any of their discourses. They are controlled in thought. Indeed, they are perfectly self-controlled. To listen to your teaching. We have been to other teachers before we come here, but we are not satisfied with any of them. Theravada did not bother to teach us, and he just kept silent. Sariputta was too exhaustive, and the Dhamma he taught us was too difficult for us. As for Therananda, he was too brief and too sketchy. We do not like any of their discourses. To them the Buddha said, "My disciples, blaming others is not something new. There is no one in this world who is never blamed. People would blame even a king, or even a Buddha. To be blamed or to be praised by a fool is of no consequence. One is truly blamed only when he is blamed by a wise man, and truly praised only when praised by a wise man." Verse 231 to 234. Be pure in body, speech and mind. Guard against evil deeds, control your body. Giving up evil deeds, cultivate good deeds. Guard against evil speech, control your speech. Giving up evil speech, cultivate good speech. Guard against evil thoughts, control your mind. Giving up evil thoughts, cultivate good thoughts. The wise are controlled in deed, they are controlled in speech, they are controlled in thought. Indeed, they are perfectly self-controlled. Story related to Dhammapada verse 231 to 234, group of 6 bhikkhus. While residing at the Velluvana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 231 to 234 with reference to a group of 6 bhikkhus. 6 bhikkhus wearing wooden sandals, and each holding a staff with both hands, were walking to and fro on a big stone slab, making much noise. The Buddha, hearing the noises, asked Therananda what was going on, and Therananda told him about the 6 bhikkhus. The Buddha then prohibited the bhikkhus from wearing wooden sandals. He further exhorted the bhikkhus to restrain themselves both in words and deeds. Dhammapada chapter 18 verse 235 to 255, impurities. Verse 235 to 238, death is near to you. 235, you are now like a withered leaf, the messengers of death are near you. You are about to set out on a long journey, yet you have no provisions for the journey. 236. Make a firm support for yourself, hasten to strive hard, and be wise. Having removed impurities, and being free from moral defilements, you shall enter the abodes of the Aryas. 237. Now you are of advanced age, you are going to the presence of the King of Death, and you cannot stop on the way, yet, you have no provisions for the journey. Two 38. Make a firm support for yourself, hasten to strive hard, and be wise. Having removed impurities, and being free from moral defilements, you will no longer be subject to rebirth and decay. Story related to Dhammapada verse 235 to 238, son of a butcher. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 235 to 238 with reference to the son of a butcher. Once in Savatthi, there was a man who had been a butcher for 55 years. All this time, he slaughtered cattle and sold the meat, and every day he took meat curry with his rice. One day, he left some meat with his wife to cook it for the family, and then left for the riverside to have his bath. During his absence, a friend coaxed his wife to sell that particular piece of meat to him. As a result, there was no meat curry for the butcher on that day. But as the butcher never took his meal without meat curry, he hurriedly went to the back of his house, where an ox was standing. He promptly cut off the tongue of the ox and baked it over a fire. When having his meal, the butcher had a bite of the tongue of the ox, but as he did so his own tongue was cut off and fell into his plate of rice. Thus the ox and the butcher were in the same plight, both of them having had their tongues cut off. The butcher was in great pain and agony, and he went about agitatedly on his knees, with blood dripping profusely from his mouth. Then the butcher died and was reborn in the Avici Niraya, hell. The butcher's wife was greatly disturbed, and she was anxious for her son to get away to some other place, lest this evil should befall him too. So she sent her son to Taxila. At Taxila, he acquired the art of a goldsmith. Later, he married the daughter of his master, and some children were born to them. When their sons came of age, he returned to Savatthi. The sons were endowed with faith in the Buddha and were religiously inclined. They were anxious about their father, who had grown old with no thought of religion or of his future existence. So one day they invited the Buddha and the bhikkhus to their house for alms food. After the meal, they said to the Buddha, "Venerable Sir, we are making this offering to you today on behalf of our father. Kindly give a discourse specially for him." So the Buddha said, "My disciple, you are getting old, but you have not made any provisions of merit for your journey to the next existence. You should now find a support for yourself." At the end of the discourse, the father of the donors of alms food, i.e., the son of the butcher, attained anagami fruition. In other words, make an island unto yourself. Strive quickly, become wise. Purged of stain and passionless, you shall enter the heavenly stage of the Aryas. Verse 239. Purify yourself gradually. The wise man removes his defilements gradually, little by little, and from moment to moment, just as the silversmith removes the impurities of silver. Story related to Dhammapada, verse 239, Brahman. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 239 with reference to a Brahman. Once, a Brahmin saw a group of bhikkhus rearranging their robes as they were preparing to enter the city for alms food. While he was looking, he found that the robes of some of the bhikkhus touched the ground and got wet because of dew on the grass. So he cleared that patch of ground. The next day, he found that as the robes of the bhikkhus touched bare ground, the robes got dirty. So he covered that patch of ground with sand. Then again, he observed that the bhikkhus would sweat when the sun was shining and that they got wet when it was raining. So finally, he built a rest house for the bhikkhus at the place where they gathered before entering the city for alms food. When the building was finished, he invited the Buddha and the bhikkhus for alms food. The Brahmin explained to the Buddha how he had performed this meritorious deed step by step. To him the Buddha replied, "O Brahmin, the wise perform their acts of merit little by little, and gradually and constantly they remove the impurities of moral defilements." Verse 240. Evil ruins oneself. As rust sprung from iron eats itself away when arisen, even so his own deeds lead the transgressor to states of woe. Story related to Dhammapada, verse 240, Theratissa. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 240 with reference to Theratissa. Once there was a Thera named Tissa in Savatthi. One day, he received a set of fine robes, and was very pleased. He intended to wear those robes the next day. But that very night he died, and because he was attached to the fine set of robes, he was reborn as a louse, and lived within the folds of the robes. As there was no one to inherit his belongings, it was decided that this particular set of robes should be shared by other bhikkhus. When the bhikkhus were preparing to share out among themselves, the louse was very much agitated and cried out, "They are destroying my robes." This cry was heard by the Buddha by means of his divine power of hearing. So he sent someone to stop the bhikkhus, and instructed them to dispose of the robes only at the end of 7 days. On the 8th day, the set of the robes which belonged to Theratissa was shared out by the bhikkhus. Later, the Buddha was asked by the bhikkhus why he had told them to wait for 7 days before sharing out the robes of Theratissa. To them the Buddha replied, "My sons, Tissa had his mind attached to this particular set of robes at the time of his death, and so he was reborn as a louse, and stayed in the folds of the robes. When you all were preparing to share out the robes, Tissa the louse was very much in agony, and was running about to and fro in the folds of the robes. If you had taken the robes at that time, Tissa the louse would have felt very bitter against you, and he would have to go to Niraya, hell. But now, Tissa has been reborn in the Tusadadeva world, and that is why I have allowed you to take the robes." Indeed, bhikkhus, attachment is very dangerous. As rust corrodes iron from which it is formed, so also, attachment destroys one and sends one to Niraya. A bhikkhu should not indulge too much in the use of the 4 requisites, or be very much attached to them. In other words, the dangers of craving erodes one and brings much suffering. Verse 241 Causes of stains. Non-repetition is the decay of learning, neglect is the ruin of houses. Laziness is the stain of beauty, heedlessness is the defect of a guard. Story related to Dhammapada verse 241, Laladai. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 241 with reference to Thera Laladai. In Savatthi, people coming back after hearing the discourses given by Thera Sariputta and Thera Mahamoggallana were always full of praise for the 2 chief disciples. On one occasion, Laladai, hearing their praises, said to those people that they would be saying the same about him after listening to his discourses. So Laladai was asked to deliver a discourse. He climbed onto the platform, but he could not say anything. So he asked the audience to let another bhikkhu take the turn first, and that he would take the next turn. In this way, he put off 3 times. The audience lost patience with him and shouted, "You big fool! When we praised the 2 chief disciples, you were vainly boasting that you could preach like them. Why don't you preach now?" So Laladai ran away, and the crowd chased him. As he was frightened and was not looking where he was going, he fell into a latrine pit. When the Buddha was told about this incident, he said, Laladai had learned very little of the Dhamma, He does not recite the religious texts regularly. He has not memorized anything. Whatever little he has learned gets rusty by not reciting. Verse 242 to 243. Ignorance is the greatest stain. Misconduct is the stain of a woman. Stinginess is the stain of one who gives. Stains are evil things both in this world and in the next. A greater stain than these is ignorance, avidya, which is the supreme stain. Abandoning this stain, be stainless, O monks. Story related to Dhammapada verse 242 to 243, a man whose wife committed adultery. While residing at the Velluvana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 242 and 243 with reference to a man whose wife committed adultery. Once, the wife of a man committed adultery. He was so ashamed on account of his wife's misbehavior that he dared not face anyone. He also kept away from the Buddha. After some time, he went to the Buddha, and the Buddha asked him why he had been absent all that time, and he explained everything. On learning the reason for his absence, the Buddha said, "My disciple, women are just like a river, or a road, or a liquor shop, or a rest house, or a water pot stand at the roadside. They associate with all sorts of people. Indeed, sexual misconduct is the cause of ruin for a woman." Verse 244. The shameless life is easy. Life is easy for one who is shameless and bold as a crow, who slanders others, and is pretentious, aggressive and corrupt. Life is hard for one with a sense of shame, who always seeks purity, who is free from attachment, who is modest and who sees clearly what is proper livelihood. Story related to verse 244 to 245, Kulasari. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 244 and 245 with reference to a bhikkhu named Kulasari who practiced medicine. One day, Kulasari came back after ministering to a patient. On his way he met Therasariputta and related to him how he went to treat a patient and had been given some delicious food for his services. He also begged Therasariputta to accept some of the food from him. Therasariputta did not say anything to him but continued on his way. Therasariputta refused to accept food from that bhikkhu because that bhikkhu had transgressed the law prohibiting bhikkhus from practicing medicine. Other bhikkhus reported about this to the Buddha, and he said to them, "Bhikkhus, a bhikkhu who is shameless is coarse in thought, word and deed. He is arrogant like a crow. He would find a living by unlawful means, and live in comfort. On the other hand, life for a bhikkhu who has a sense of shame is not easy." Verse 246 to 248. By immorality the fool ruins himself. He who destroys life, tells lies, takes what is not given him, commits adultery and takes intoxicating drinks, digs up his own roots even in this very life. Know this, O man. Not restraining oneself is evil. Do not let greed and ill will subject you to prolonged suffering. Story related to Dhammapada verse 246 to 248, 5 lay disciples. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 246, 247 and 248 with reference to 5 lay disciples. On one occasion 5 lay disciples were keeping Sabbath at the Jetavana monastery. Most of them were observing only 1 or 2 of the 5 moral precepts, sila. Each one of them observing a particular precept claimed that the precept observed by him was the most difficult, and there were a lot of arguments. In the end, they came to the Buddha with this problem. To them the Buddha said, "You should not consider any individual precept as being easy or unimportant. Each and every one of the precepts must be strictly observed. Do not think lightly of any of the precepts, none of them is easy to observe." Verse 249 to 250, the envious are not at peace. People give alms according to their faith and at their good pleasure. One who is discontented about the food and drink of others does not attain concentration, samadhi, be it by day or by night. One in whom this kind of attitude is destroyed at its roots and abolished, he attains concentration, samadhi, be it by day or by night. Story related to Dhammapada verse 249 to 250, the story of Tissa. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 249 and 250 with reference to Tissa, a young bhikkhu. Tissa, a young bhikkhu, had a very bad habit of disparaging other people's charities and good deeds. He even criticized the charities given by such renowned donors like Anathapindika and Visakha. Besides, he boasted that his relatives were very rich and were like a well where anyone could come for water. Hearing him boast thus, other bhikkhus were very skeptical, so they decided to find out the truth. Some young bhikkhus went to the village from where he came and made inquiries. They found out that Tissa's relatives were all poor and that all this time Tissa had only been making a vain boast. When the Buddha was told about this, he said, "Bhikkhus, a bhikkhu who is displeased with others receiving gifts and offerings can never attain magga and phala." Verse 251, there is no fire like lust. There is no fire like lust, no bond like hate. No net like delusion, no torrent like craving. Story related to Dhammapada verse 251, 5 lay disciples. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 251 with reference to 5 lay disciples. On one occasion, 5 lay disciples were present while the Buddha was expounding the Dhamma at the Jetavana monastery. One of them was asleep while sitting, the second one was drawing lines with his fingers on the ground, the third was trying to shake a tree, the fourth was looking up at the sky. The fifth was the only one who was respectfully and attentively listening to the Buddha. Thera Ananda, who was near the Buddha fanning him, saw the different behavior of the 5 disciples, and said to the Buddha, "Venerable Sir, while you were expounding the Dhamma like big drops of rain falling from the sky, Only one out of those 5 people were listening attentively. Then Thera described the different behavior of the other 4 to the Buddha and asked why they were behaving thus. The Buddha then explained to Thera Ananda, these people could not get rid of their old habits. In their past existences, the first one was a snake. As a snake usually coils itself up and goes to sleep, so also, this man goes to sleep while listening to the Dhamma. The one who was scratching the earth with his hand was an earthworm, the one who was shaking the tree was a monkey, the one who was gazing up at the sky was an astronomer, and the one who was listening attentively to the Dhamma was a learned astrologer. In this connection, Ananda, you must remember that one must be attentive to be able to understand the Dhamma, and that there are many people who cannot follow what is being said. Thera Ananda then asked the Buddha, Venerable Sir, what are the things that prevent people from being able to take in the Dhamma? And the Buddha replied, Ananda, passion, raga, ill will, dosa, and ignorance, moha, are the 3 things that prevent people from taking in the Dhamma. Passion burns one, there is no fire like passion. The world may burn up when 7 suns rise in the sky, but that happens very rarely. Passion burns always and without any break. Verse 252, easy to see are the faults of others. The faults of others are easily seen, one's own faults are seen with difficulty. One knows the faults of others like chaff, but one covers up one's own as a dishonest gambler covers up a losing throw of the dice. Story related to Dhammapada verse 252, Mendaka, the rich man. While residing near the town of Badia, the Buddha uttered verse 252 with reference to the renowned rich man Mendaka and his family. Once, during his tour of Anga and Uttara regions, the Buddha saw in his vision that time was ripe for Mendaka, his wife, his son, his daughter-in-law, his granddaughter and his servant, to attain Sotapaddi fruition. Seeing the prospect of these 6 people attaining Sotapaddi fruition, the Buddha went to the town of Badia. Mendaka was an extremely rich man. It was said that he found a large number of life-size golden statues of goats in his backyard. For this reason, he was known as Mendaka, a goat, the rich man. Again, it was also said that during the time of Vipassy Buddha he had donated a monastery for Vipassy Buddha, and a congregation hall, complete with a platform for the preacher. On completion of these buildings he made offerings of alms food to Vipassy Buddha and the bhikkhus for 4 months. Then, in yet another of his past existences, when he was a rich man in Varanasi, there was a famine throughout the region. One day, they had cooked a meal just enough for the members of the family when a Paksabuddha stood at the door for alms food. Then and there he offered all the food. But due to his great faith and generosity, the rice pot was later found to be miraculously filled up again, so also were his granaries. Mendaka and his family, hearing that the Buddha was coming to Badia, went to pay homage to him. After hearing the discourse given by the Buddha, Mandaka, his wife Kandapaduma, his son Danankaya, his daughter-in-law Sumanadevi, his granddaughter Visakha, and the servant Punna attained Sotapaddy fruition. Mandaka then told the Buddha how on his way, some ascetics had spoken ill of the Buddha, and had tried to dissuade him from coming to see him. The Buddha then said, "My disciple, it is natural for people not to see one's own faults, and to exaggerate other people's faults and failings." Verse 253, Defilements multiply in fault-finders. He who pays attention to the faults of others, and is always irritable, his defilements, asavas, grow. He is far from the destruction of the defilements. Story related to Dhammapada verse 253, Thera Ajhanasani. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 253 with reference to Thera Ajhanasani. Thera Ajhanasani was always finding fault with and speaking ill of others. Other bhikkhus reported about him to the Buddha. The Buddha replied to them, "Bhikkhus, if someone finds fault with another so as to teach him in good way, it is not an act of evil and is therefore not to be blamed. But, if someone is always finding fault with others and speaking ill of them just out of spite and malice, he will not attain concentration and mental absorption, jhana. He will not be able to understand the Dhamma, and moral, intoxicants asavas, will increase in him." Verse 254 to 255, No saints outside of the Buddhadhamma. In the sky there is no track. Outside there is no recluse. Mankind delights in obstacles. The Tathagatas are free from obstacles. In the sky there is no track. Outside there is no recluse. There are no conditioned things that are eternal. There is no instability in the Buddhas. Story related to Dhammapada verse 254 to 255, Subhata the wandering ascetic. Verses 254 and 255 were uttered by the Buddha in the Sal Grove of the Malla princes near Kusinara, just before the parinibbana, passing away, of the Buddha, in reply to the questions raised by Subhata, the wandering ascetic, Parabhajaka. Subhata the wandering ascetic was staying at Kusinara when he heard that the parinibbana of Gautama Buddha would take place in the last watch of that night. Subhata had 3 questions which had been troubling him for a long time. He had already put these questions to other religious leaders, namely, Purana Kassapa, Makali Gosala, Ajita Kasakambala, Pakuta Kakayana, Sankaya Belathaputa, and Nagantha Nadapada, but their answers did not satisfy him. He had not yet asked Gautama Buddha, and he felt that only the Buddha could answer his questions. So, he hurried off to the Sal Grove, but the Venerable Ananda did not allow him to see the Buddha, because the Buddha was by that time very weak. The Buddha overheard their conversation and consented to see Subhata. Subhata asked 3 questions. They are, 1. Are there any tracks in the sky? 2. Are there any Arya Bhikkhus, Samamas, outside the teaching of the Buddha? And 3. Is there any conditioned thing, sankhara, that is permanent? The Buddha's answer to all the above questions was negative. At the end of the discourse, Subhata attained anagami fruition, and as requested by him, the Buddha admitted him to the order of the bhikkhus. Subhata was the last one to become a bhikkhu in the lifetime of the Buddha. Eventually, Subhata attained arahatship. Dhammapada chapter 19 established verse 256 to 272. Verse 256 to 257. The just make a thorough investigation. He is not just if he decides a case arbitrarily. The wise man should decide after considering both what is right and what is wrong. The wise man who decides not arbitrarily but in accordance with the law is one who safeguards the law. He is to be called one who abides by the law. Dhammapada. Story related to Dhammapada verse 256 to 257. The judge. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 256 and 257 with reference to some judges who were corrupt. One day, some bhikkhus were returning from their round of alms food when it rained, and they went into a law court to take shelter. While they were there, they found out that some judges, having taken bribes, were deciding cases arbitrarily. They reported the matter to the Buddha, and the Buddha replied, "Bhikkhus, in deciding cases, if one is influenced by affection or by monetary consideration, he cannot be called the just, or a judge who abides by the law. If one weighs the evidence intelligently and decides a case impartially, then he is to be called the just or a judge who abides by the law." Verse 258. Those who speak a lot is not necessarily wise. One is not wise merely because one speaks much. He who is secure, without hate, and fearless is called wise. Story related to Dhammapada verse 258. Group of 6 bhikkhus. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 258 with reference to a group of 6 bhikkhus. Once, there was a group of 6 bhikkhus who made trouble at the place of eating either in the monastery or in the village. One day, while some Samanas were having their alms food, the group of 6 bhikkhus came in and said boastfully to the Samanas, "Look! We only are the wise." Then they started throwing things about, leaving the place of eating in disorder. When the Buddha was told about this, he said, "Bhikkhus, I do not say that one who talks much, abuses, and bullies others is a wise man. Only he who is free from hatred and harms no one is a wise man." Verse 259. One versed in Dhamma does not speak much. One is not versed in the Dhamma merely because one speaks a lot. He who hears little and sees the Dhamma within, and who does not neglect the Dhamma, he is versed in the Dhamma. Story related to Dhammapada verse 259. Ekadana the Arahat. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 259 with reference to a bhikkhu who was an arahat. This bhikkhu lived in a grove near Savatthi. He was known as Ekadana because he knew only one stanza of the teachings, by heart. But the Thera fully understood the meaning of the Dhamma as conveyed by the stanza. On each Upasatha day, he would exhort others to listen to the Dhamma, and he himself would recite the one stanza he knew. Every time he had finished his recitation, the devas of the forests praised him and applauded him resoundingly. On one Upasatha day, 2 learned Theras, who were well versed in the Tipitaka, accompanied by 500 bhikkhus, came to his place. Ekadana asked the 2 Theras to preach the Dhamma. They inquired if there were many who wished to listen to the Dhamma in this out-of-the-way place. Ekadana answered in the affirmative and also told them that even the devas of the forests usually came, and that they usually praised and applauded at the end of discourses. So, the 2 learned Theras took turns to preach the Dhamma, but when their discourses ended, there was no applause from the devas of the forests. The 2 learned Theras were puzzled, they even doubted the words of Ekadana. But Ekadana insisted that the guardian spirits used to come and always applauded at the end of each discourse. The 2 Theras then pressed Ekadana to do the preaching himself. Ekadana held the fan in front of him and recited the usual stanza. At the end of the recitation, the guardian spirits applauded as usual. The bhikkhus who had accompanied the 2 learned Theras complained that the devas inhabiting the forests were very partial. They reported the matter to the Buddha on arrival at the Jetavana monastery. To them the Buddha said, "Bhikkhus, I do not say that a bhikkhu who has learnt much and talks much of the Dhamma is one who is versed in the Dhamma, Tamadhara. One who has learnt very little and knows only one stanza of the Dhamma, but fully comprehends the 4 noble truths, and is ever mindful is the one who is truly versed in the Dhamma." Verse 261 Gray hair does not make an elder. He is not an elder, just because his hair is gray. He who is ripe only in years is called one grown old in vain. Only a wise man who comprehends the 4 noble truths and the Dhamma, who is harmless and virtuous, who restrains his senses, and has rid himself of moral defilements is indeed called a Thera. Story related to Dhammapada verse 260-261, Therabadiya. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 260 and 261 with reference to Therabadiya. He was also known as Lakandakabadiya because he was very short in stature. One day, 30 bhikkhus came to pay homage to the Buddha. The Buddha knew that time was ripe for those 30 bhikkhus to attain arahantship. So he asked them whether they had seen a Thera, elder, as they came into the room. They answered that they did not see a Thera, but they saw only a young Samanera as they came in. Whereupon, the Buddha said to them, "Bhikkhus, that person is not a Samanera, he is a senior bhikkhu." Bhikkhu, although he is small-built and very unassuming. I do say that one is not a Thera just because he is old and looks like a Thera, Only he who comprehends the Four Noble Truths, and does not harm others, is to be called a Thera. Verse 262 to 263. Eloquence does not make a gentleman. Not by mere eloquence, nor by handsome appearance, does one become a gentleman if he is jealous, selfish, and deceitful. However, in whom these are wholly cut off, uprooted, and extinct, that wise man who is purged of hatred is called a gentleman. Story related to Dhammapada verse 262 to 263. Some bhikkhus. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 262 and 263 with reference to some bhikkhus who were very envious of other bhikkhus. At the monastery, young bhikkhus and samanas were in the habit of attending to older bhikkhus who were their teachers. They washed and dyed the robes, or else performed other small services for their teachers. Some bhikkhus noticing these services envied those senior bhikkhus, and so they thought out a plan that would benefit them materially. Their plan was that they would suggest to the Buddha that young bhikkhus and samanas should be required to come to them for further instruction and guidance even though they had been taught by their respective teachers. When they went to the Buddha with this proposal, the Buddha, knowing full well their motive, turned it down. To them the Buddha said, "Bhikkhus, I do not say that you are good-hearted just because you can talk eloquently. Only he who has got rid of covetousness and all that is evil by means of Arahata Magga is to be called a good-hearted man." Verse 264 to 265. A shaven head doesn't make a monk. Not by a shaven head does a man become a monk, if he lacks morality and austere practices, and tells lies. How could he who is full of covetousness and greed be a monk? He who has totally subdued all evil, great and small, is called a monk because he has overcome all evil. Story related to Dhammapada verse 264 to 265. Bhikkhu Hatthaka. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 264 and 265 with reference to a bhikkhu named Hatthaka. Bhikkhu Hatthaka was in the habit of challenging ascetics of non-Buddhist faiths to meet him in a certain place to debate on religious matters. He would then go out by himself to the self-appointed place. When nobody appeared, he would boast, "Look, those wandering ascetics dare not meet me, they have been beaten by me," and such other things. The Buddha called Hatthaka to him and said, "Bhikkhu, why do you behave in this way? One who says such things cannot become a samana in spite of his shaven head. Only one who has rid himself of all evil is to be called a samana." Verse 266 to 267. Begging does not make a monk. He does not become a bhikkhu merely because he stands at the door for alms. He cannot become a bhikkhu because he acts according to a faith which is not in conformity with the Dhamma. In this world, he who lays aside both good and evil, who leads the life of purity, and lives meditating on the Khanda aggregates is indeed called a bhikkhu. Story related to Dhammapada verse 266 to 267, Brahman. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 266 and 267 with reference to a Brahman. Once, there was a Brahmin who was in the habit of going round for alms. One day, he thought, Samama Gautama has declared that one who lives by going round for alms is a bhikkhu. That being so, I should also be called a bhikkhu. So thinking, he went to the Buddha and said to him that he, the Brahmin, should also be called a bhikkhu, because he also went round for alms food. To him the Buddha replied, Brahmin, I do not say that you are a bhikkhu simply because you go round for alms food. One who professes a wrong faith and acts accordingly is not to be called a bhikkhu. Only he who lives. Meditating on the impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and insubstantiality of the aggregates is to be called a bhikkhu. Verse 268 to 269, Silence alone does not make a sage. Not by silence alone does he who is dull and ignorant become a sage. But a wise man, as if holding a pair of scales, selects only the best. He who shuns evil is for that reason a sage. He who understands both worlds is called a sage. Story related to Dhammapada verse 268 to 269, followers of non-Buddhist doctrines. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 268 and 269 with reference to some non-Buddhist ascetics. To those who offered them food or other things, those ascetics would say words of blessing. They would say, May you be free from danger, may you prosper and get rich, may you live long, etc. At that time, the followers of the Buddha did not say anything after receiving something from their lay disciples. This was because during the first 20 years after the Buddha's attainment of Buddhahood, they were instructed to remain silent on receiving offerings. Since the followers of the Buddha were silent when ascetics of other doctrines were saying things which were pleasing to their disciples, people began to compare the two groups. When the Buddha heard about this, he permitted the bhikkhus to say words of blessing to their disciples after receiving offerings. As a result of that, more and more people invited the followers of the Buddha for alms. Then, the ascetics of other doctrines remarked with disdain, We adhere to the practice of the muni and keep silent, whereas the followers of Samama Gautama go about talking exuberantly in the eating places. On hearing those disparaging remarks, the Buddha said, Bhikkhus, there are some who keep silent because they are ignorant and timid, and some who keep silent because they do not want to share their profound knowledge with others. Only one who has overcome evil is to be called a muni. Verse 270, True Aryas, noble ones, are harmless. He is not a noble one if he harms living beings. By harmlessness towards all beings he is called noble. Story related to Dhammapada verse 270, a fisherman named Arya. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 270 with reference to a fisherman named Arya. Once, there was a fisherman who lived near the north gate of Savatthi. One day, through his supernormal power, the Buddha found that time was ripe for the fisherman to attain Sotapaddi fruition. So on his return from the alms round, the Buddha, followed by the bhikkhus, stopped near the place where Arya was fishing. When the fisherman saw the Buddha, he threw away his fishing gear and came and stood near the Buddha. The Buddha then proceeded to ask the names of his bhikkhus in the presence of the fisherman, and finally, he asked the name of the fisherman. When the fisherman replied that his name was Arya, the Buddha said that the noble ones, Aryas, do not harm any living being, but since the fisherman was taking the lives of fish, he was not worthy of his name. Then the Buddha spoke in verse as follows: He is not a noble one if he harms living beings. By harmlessness towards all beings he is called noble. At the end of the discourse, the fisherman attained Sotapaddi fruition. Verse 271 to 272. A monk should not stop halfway. Not only by mere moral practice, nor by much learning, nor by acquiring concentration, nor by dwelling in seclusion, nor by assuring oneself, I enjoy the bliss of anagami fruition that is not enjoyed by common worldlings, Puthajanas, should the bhikkhu rest content without attaining the extinction of moral intoxicants, asavas, i.e., without attaining arahatship. Story related to Dhammapada verse 271 to 272, some bhikkhus. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 271 and 272 with reference to some bhikkhus. Once, there were some bhikkhus who were endowed with virtue. Some of them had strictly observed the austere practices, Dhutanga, some had wide knowledge of the Dhamma, some had achieved mental absorption, jhana, some had achieved anagami phala, etc. All of them thought that since they had achieved that much, it would be quite easy for them to attain arahata phala, arahantship. With this thought, they went to the Buddha. The Buddha asked them, Bhikkhus, have you attained arahata phala? Then they replied that they were in such a condition that it would not be difficult for them to attain arahata phala at any time. To them the Buddha said, Bhikkhus, just because you are endowed with morality, sila, just because you have attained anagami phala, you should not be complacent and think that there is just a little more to be done, unless you have eradicated all moral intoxicants, asavas. You must not think that you have realized perfect bliss of arahata fruition. Dhammapada chapter 20 verse 273 to 289, the path. Verse 273 to 276, the Eightfold Path is the best. Verse 273, of paths, the path of 8 constituents is the noblest, of truths, the 4 noble truths are the noblest, of the Dhammas, the absence of craving, i.e., nibbana, is the noblest, of the 2-legged beings, the all-seeing Buddha is the noblest. Verse 274, this is the only path, and there is none other, for the purity of vision. Follow this path, it will bewilder Mara. Verse 275, following this path, you will make an end of dukkha. Having myself known the path which can lead to the removal of the thorns of moral defilements, I have shown you the path. Verse 276, you yourselves should make the effort, the Tathagatas, Buddhas, only can show the way. Those who practice the tranquility and insight meditation are freed from the bond of Mara. Story related to Dhammapada verse 273 to 276, 500 bhikkhus. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 273 to 276 with reference to 500 bhikkhus. 500 bhikkhus, after accompanying the Buddha to a village, returned to the Jetavana monastery. In the evening, they talked about the trip, especially the nature of the land, whether it was level or hilly, clayey or stony, etc. The Buddha came to them in the midst of their conversation and said to them, Bhikkhus, the path you are talking about is external to you. A bhikkhu should only be concerned with the path of the noble ones, Aryas, and strive to do what should be done for the attainment of the Arya path, Magga, that leads to the realization of the perfect peace, Nibbana. Verse 277 to 279, all conditions are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and a non-self. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with insight, all conditioned things are unsatisfactory. When one sees this with insight, panna, one becomes weary of suffering. This is the way to purity. phenomena are not self. When one sees this with insight, panna, one is disenchanted with suffering. This is the path to purity. Story related to Dhammapada verse 277 to 279, Anicca, Dukkha, and Anatta. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 277, 200, and 78. On impermanence, Anicca, 500 bhikkhus, after receiving their subject of meditation from the Buddha, went into the forest to practice meditation, but they made little progress. So, they returned to the Buddha to ask for another subject of meditation which would suit them better. On reflection, the Buddha found that those bhikkhus had, during the time of Kassapa Buddha, meditated on impermanence. So, he said, Bhikkhus, all conditioned phenomena are subject to change and decay, and are therefore impermanent. Then the Buddha spoke in verse as follows, verse 277, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. When one sees this with insight wisdom, one becomes weary of dukkha, i.e., the khandhas. This is the path to purity. At the end of the discourse, those 500 bhikkhus attained arahantship. On dukkha, the story is the same as the story on anicca. Here, the Buddha on reflection found that another group of 500 bhikkhus had meditated on dukkha. So, he said, Bhikkhus, all khandha aggregates are oppressive and unsatisfactory, thus all khandhas are dukkha. Then the Buddha spoke in verse as follows. Verse 278, all conditioned phenomena are dukkha. When one sees this with insight wisdom, one becomes weary of dukkha, i.e., the khandhas. This is the path to purity. At the end of the discourse, those 500 bhikkhus attained arahantship. On insubstantiality or non-self, anatta. The story is the same as the stories on anicca and dukkha. Here, the Buddha on reflection found that still another group of 500 bhikkhus had meditated on insubstantiality or non-self, anatta. So, he said, Bhikkhus, all khandha aggregates are insubstantial, they are not subject to one's control. Then the Buddha spoke in verse as follows. Verse 279, all phenomena, dhammas, are without self. When one sees this with insight wisdom, one becomes weary of dukkha, i.e., the khandhas. This is the path to purity. The end of the discourse. All those 500 bhikkhus attained arahantship. Verse 280, the lazy miss the path. The idler who does not strive when he should be striving, who though young and strong is given to idleness, whose thoughts are weak and wandering, does not by wisdom realize the path. Story related to Dhammapada verse 280, Theratissa the idle one. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 280, with reference to Tissa, a lazy bhikkhu. Once, 500 young men were admitted into the order by the Buddha in Savatthi. After receiving a subject of meditation from the Buddha, all the new bhikkhus except one went to the forest to practice meditation. They practiced zealously and vigilantly, so that in due course all of them attained arahantship. When they returned to the monastery to pay homage to him, the Buddha was very pleased. pleased and satisfied with their achievement. Bhikkhu Tissa, who stayed behind, did not try hard and therefore achieved nothing. When Tissa found that the relationship between the Buddha and those bhikkhus Bickus was very cordial and intimate. He felt rather neglected, and regretted that he had wasted all that time. So he resolved to practice meditation throughout the night. As he was doing walking meditation that night, he slipped and broke a thigh bone. Other Bickus, hearing his cry, went to help him. On hearing about the above incident, the Buddha said, "Bickus, one who does not strive when he should be striving but idle away his time will not attain mental absorption, jhana, and magga insight." Verse 281, Purify thoughts, words, and deeds. Guarded in speech, as well as controlled in mind, let one do no, ethically, unskillful thing with the body. Purifying these three avenues of action, let him attain the way made known by the sages. Story related to Dhammapada verse 281, Swine Pita. While residing at the Velluvana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 281 with reference to a swine pita. Once Thera Mahamoggalana was coming down the Gijjakuta hill with Thera Lakana when he saw a miserable, ever-hungry pita, with the head of a swine and the body of a human being. On seeing the pita, Thera Mahamoggalana smiled but did not say anything. Back at the monastery, Thera Mahamoggalana, in the presence of the Buddha, talked about the swine pita with its mouth swarming with maggots. The Buddha also said that he himself had seen that very pita soon after his attainment of Buddhahood, but that he did not say anything about it because people might not believe him and thus they would be doing wrong to him. Then the Buddha proceeded to relate the story about the swine pita. During the time of Kassapa Buddha, this particular pita was a bhikkhu who often expounded the Dhamma. On one occasion, he came to a monastery where two bhikkhus were staying together. After staying with those two for some time, he found that he was doing quite well, because people liked his expositions. Then it occurred to him that it would be even better if he could make the other two bhikkhus leave the place and have the monastery all to himself. Thus, he tried to set one against the other. The two bhikkhus quarreled and left the monastery in different directions. On account of this evil deed, that bhikkhu was reborn in Avicii Niraya, and he was serving out the remaining part of his term of suffering as a swine pita with its mouth swarming with maggots. Then the Buddha exhorted, a bhikkhu should be calm and well restrained in thought, word, and deed. Verse 282, Cultivate wisdom. From meditation arises wisdom. Without meditation wisdom wanes. Knowing this twofold path of gain and loss, let one so conduct oneself, so that wisdom increases. Story related to Dhammapada verse 282, Therapathala. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 282, with reference to Therapathala. Pathala was a senior bhikkhu who knew the Pitaka well and was actually teaching the Dhamma to 500 bhikkhus. Because he knew the Pitaka, he was also very conceited. The Buddha knew his weakness and wanted him to mend his ways and put him on the right path. So, Whenever Potala came to pay obeisance, the Buddha would address him as useless Potala. When Potala heard these remarks, he pondered over those words of the Buddha and came to realize that the Buddha had made those unkind remarks because he, Potala, had not made any serious effort to practice meditation and had not achieved any of the maggas or even any level of mental absorption, jhana. Thus, without telling anyone, Potala left for a monastery at a place 20 yojanas away from the Jetavana monastery. At that monastery, there were 30 bhikkhus. First, he went to the most senior bhikkhu and humbly requested him to be his mentor, but the Thera, wishing to humble him, asked him to go to the next senior bhikkhu, who in his turn sent him on to the next. In this way, he was sent from one to the other until he came to a 7-year-old Arahat Samanera. The young Samanera accepted him as a pupil only after ascertaining that Potala would obediently follow his instructions. As instructed by the Samanera, Potala kept his mind firmly fixed on the true nature of the body. He was very ardent and vigilant in his meditation. The Buddha saw Potala in his vision and through supernormal power made Potala feel his presence and encouraged him to be steadfast and ardent. At the end of the discourse, Potala attained arahatship. Verse 283 to 284, be without attachment. Verse 283, O Bhikkhus, cut down the forest of craving, not the real tree. The forest of craving breeds danger of rebirth. Cut down the forest of craving as well as its undergrowth, and be free from craving. Verse 284, so long as the craving of man for woman is not cut down and the slightest trace of it remains, so long is his mind in bondage as the calf is bound to its mother. Story related to Dhammapada verse 283 to 284, 5 old bhikkhus. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 283 and 284 with reference to 5 old bhikkhus. Once, in Savatthi, there were 5 friends who became bhikkhus only in their old age. These 5 bhikkhus were in the habit of going together to their old homes for alms food. Of the former wives of those 5, one lady in particular, by the name of Madhurapasika, was a good cook and she looked after them very well. Thus, the 5 bhikkhus went mostly to her house. But one day, Madhurapasika fell ill and died suddenly. The old bhikkhus felt their loss very deeply, and together they cried praising her virtues and lamenting their loss. The Buddha called those bhikkhus to him and said, Bhikkhus, you all are feeling pain and sorrow because you are not free from greed, hatred, and ignorance, raga, dosa, moha, which are like a forest. Cut down this forest and you will be freed from greed, hatred, and ignorance. Verse 285, Path to Peace. Cut off your craving as one plucks an autumn lily with the hand. Nibbana has been expounded on by the Buddha. Cultivate that path which leads to it. Story related to Dhammapada verse 285, Thera, who had been a goldsmith. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 285 with reference to a bhikkhu, a pupil of Therasariputta. Once, a young, handsome son of a goldsmith was admitted into the order by Therasariputta. The young bhikkhu was given loathsomeness of the dead body as the subject of meditation by Therasariputta. After taking the subject of meditation, he left for the forest and practiced meditation there, but he made very little progress. So he returned twice to Therasariputta for further instructions. Still, he made no progress. So Therasariputta took the young bhikkhu to the Buddha, and related everything about the young bhikkhu. The Buddha knew that the young bhikkhu was the son of a goldsmith, and also that he had been born in the family of goldsmiths during his past 500 existences. Therefore the Buddha changed the subject of meditation for the young bhikkhu. Instead of loathsomeness, he was instructed to meditate on pleasantness. With his supernormal power, the Buddha created a beautiful lotus flower as big as a cartwheel and told the young bhikkhu to stick it on the mound of sand just outside the monastery. The young bhikkhu, concentrating on the big, beautiful, fragrant lotus flower, was able to get rid of the hindrances. He was filled with delightful satisfaction, pity, and step by step he progressed until he reached as far as the fourth level of mental absorption, jhana. The Buddha saw him from his perfumed chamber and with his supernormal power made the flower wither instantly. Seeing the flower wither and change its color, the bhikkhu perceived the impermanent nature of the flower and of all other things and beings. That led to the realization of the impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and the insubstantiality of all conditioned things. At that instant, the Buddha sent forth his radiance and appeared as if in person to the young bhikkhu and instructed him to get rid of craving, tanha. Verse 286, a fool does not think of death. Here will I live in the rainy season, here will I live in the cold season and the hot season, so imagines the fool, not realizing the danger of approaching death. Story related to Dhammapada verse 286, Mahadana, a merchant. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 286 with reference to Mahadana, a merchant from Varanasi. Once, a merchant from Varanasi came to a festival in Savatthi with 500 carts fully loaded with textiles and other merchandise. When he reached a river bank near Savatthi, the river was in spate, so he could not cross the river. He was held up for 7 days as it was raining hard and the water did not subside. By that time, he was already late for the festival, and there was no need for him to cross the river. Since he had come from a long distance, he did not want to return home with his full load of merchandise. So he decided to spend the rainy season, the cold season, and the hot season in that place, and said so to his assistants. The Buddha, while going on an alms round, knew the decision of the merchant, and he smiled. Ananda asked the Buddha why he smiled, and the Buddha replied, "Ananda, do you see that merchant? He is thinking that he would stay here and sell his goods the whole year. He is not aware that he would die here in 7 days' time. What should be done today. Who would know that one would die tomorrow? We have no date fixed with the king of death. For one who is mindful by day or by night, who is not disturbed by moral defilements, and is energetic, to live for just one night is a well-spent life. Then the Buddha sent Ananda to Mahadana, the merchant. Ananda explained to Mahadana that time was running out for him, and that he should practice mindfulness instead of being negligent. On learning about his impending death, Mahadana was alarmed and frightened. So, for 7 days, he invited the Buddha and other bhikkhus for alms food. On the 7th day, the Buddha expounded a discourse in appreciation, Anumadana. At the end of the discourse, Mahadana the merchant attained Sotapaddy fruition. He followed the Buddha for some distance and returned. On his return, he had a severe headache and passed away soon after. Mahadana was reborn in the Tusatadeva world. Verse 287. Death takes away the attached. That infatuated man, whose delight is in offspring and cattle, death goes and carries him off, as a great flood sweeps away a sleeping village. Story related to Dhammapada verse 287, Kisagotami. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 287 with reference to Kisagotami, the daughter of a rich man from Savatthi. Kisagotami came to the Buddha as she was stricken with grief due to the death of her only son. To her the Buddha said, "Kisagotami, you think you are the only one who has lost a son. Death comes to all beings. Before their desires are satiated, death takes them away." Verse 288 to 289. No protection at the moment of death. Not sons, nor parents, nor close relatives can protect one assailed by death. Indeed, neither kith nor kin can give protection. Realizing this fact, let the virtuous and wise person swiftly clear the way that leads to Nibbana. Story related to Dhammapada verse 288 to 289, Padakara. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 288 and 289 with reference to Padakara, the daughter of a rich man from Savatthi. As Padakara had lost her husband and her 2 sons, as well as her parents and 3 brothers almost at the same time, she was driven to near insanity. When she approached the Buddha, he said to her, "Padakara, sons and daughters cannot look after you, so even if they are alive, they do not exist for you." The wise man observes morality, sila, and clears the obstacles to the path leading to Nibbana. Dhammapada chapter 21 verse 290 to pleasures. Great happiness is to be found. The wise should give up small pleasure seeing the prospect of great happiness. Story related to Dhammapada verse 290, Buddha's former deeds. The Buddha uttered verse 290 with reference to the power and glory of the Buddha as witnessed by many people on his visit to Vesali. Once, a famine broke out in Vesali. It began with a serious drought. Because of drought, there was almost a total failure of crops, and many people died of starvation. This was followed by an epidemic of diseases, and as people could hardly cope with the disposal of the corpses, there was a lot of stench in the air. This stench attracted the ogres. The people of Vesali were facing the dangers of destruction by famine, disease, and also by the ogres. In their grief and sorrow, they tried to look for a refuge. They thought of going for help from various sources, but finally, they decided to invite the Buddha. So a mission headed by Mahali, the Lichavi prince, and the son of the chief Brahmin were sent to King Bimbisara to request the Buddha to pay a visit to Vesali and help them in their distress. The Buddha knew that this visit would be of much benefit to many people, so he consented to go to Vesali. Accordingly, King Bimbisara repaired the road between Rajagaha and the bank of the river Ganga. He also made other preparations and set up special resting places at an interval of every yojana. When everything was ready, the Buddha set out for Vesali with 500 bhikkhus. King Bimbisara also accompanied the Buddha. On the fifth day, they came to the bank of the river Ganga, and King Bimbisara sent word to the Lichavi princes. On the other side of the river, the Lichavi princes had repaired the road between the river and Vesali and had set up resting places as had been done by King Bimbisara on his side of the river. The Buddha went to Vesali with Lichavi princes, but King Bimbisara stayed behind. As soon as the Buddha reached the other bank of the river, heavy rains fell in torrents, thus cleansing up Vesali. The Buddha was put up in the rest house On the other side of the river, the Lichavi princes had repaired the road between the river and Visali and had set up resting places as had been done by King Bimbisara on his side of the river. The Buddha went to Visali with Lichavi princes, but King Bimbisara stayed behind. As soon as the Buddha reached the other bank of the river, heavy rains fell in torrents, thus cleansing up Visali. The Buddha was put up in the rest house, which was specially prepared for him in the central part of the city. Sakka, king of the Devis, came with his followers to pay obeisance to the Buddha, and the ogres fled. That same evening the Buddha delivered the Ratana Sutta and asked the Venerable Ananda to go round between the threefold walls of the city with the Lichavi princes and recite it. The Venerable Ananda did as he was told. As the protective verses Paritas were being recited, many of those who were sick recovered and followed the Venerable Ananda to the presence of the Buddha. The Buddha delivered the same sutta and repeated it for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, everything was back to normal in Visali. The Lichavi princes and the people of Visali were very much relieved and were overjoyed. Were overjoyed. They were also very grateful to the Buddha. They paid obeisance to the Buddha. They were also very grateful to the Buddha. They paid obeisance to the Buddha and made offerings to him on a grand and lavish scale. They also accompanied the Buddha on his return journey until they came to the bank of the Ganga at the end of 3 days. On arrival at the river bank, King Bimbisara was waiting for the Buddha, so also were the Devas and the Brahmas and the king of the Nagas with their respective entourage. All of them paid obeisance and made offerings to the Buddha. The Devas and the Brahmas paid homage with umbrellas, flowers, etc., and sang in praise of the Buddha. The Nagas had come with barges made of gold, silver, and rubies to invite the Buddha to the realm of the Nagas. They had also strewn the surface of the water with 500 kinds of lotuses. This was one of the 3 occasions in the life of the Buddha when human beings, Devas and Brahmas, came together to pay homage to the Buddha. The first occasion was when the Buddha manifested his power and glory by the miracle of the pears, emitting rays of light and sprays of water, and the second was on his return from the Tavatimsadeva world after expounding the Abhidhamma. The Buddha, wishing to honor the Nagas, then paid a visit to the realm of the Nagas accompanied by the Bhikkhus. The Buddha and his entourage went in the 500 barges brought by the Nagas. After his visit to the realm of the Nagas, the Buddha returned to Rajagaha accompanied by King Bimbisara. They arrived at Rajagaha on the 5th day. 2 days after their arrival at Rajagaha, while the Bhikkhus were talking about the amazing grandeur and glory of the trip to and from Visali, the Buddha arrived on the scene. On learning the subject of their talk, the Buddha said to them, "Bhikkhus, that I have been revered so much by Brahmas, Devas, and human beings alike, and that they have made offerings on such a grand and lavish scale to me on this occasion is not due to the power I now possess, It is simply because I had done some small meritorious deeds in one of my previous existences that I now enjoy such great benefits. Then, the Buddha related the story of one of his past existences, when he was a Brahmin by the name of Sankha. Once there was a Brahmin named Sankha who lived in the city of Taxila. He had a son named Susama. When Susama was 16 years old, he was sent by his father to another Brahmin to study astrology. His teacher taught him all that should be learnt, but Susama was not fully satisfied. So, his teacher directed him to approach the Pakska Buddhas, who were then staying in Isipatana. Susama went to Isipatana, but the Pakska Buddhas told him that he must first become a bhikkhu. Thus, he became a bhikkhu, and was instructed how to conduct himself as a bhikkhu. Susama diligently practiced meditation. And he soon comprehended the Four Noble Truths, acquired Bodhi Gnana, and became a Paksabuddha himself. But as a result of his previous karma, Susama did not live long. He realized Parinibbana soon afterwards. Sankha, the father of Susama, came in search of his son, but when he arrived, he only found the stupa where the relics of his son were enshrined. The Brahmin felt very much distressed at the loss of his son. He proceeded to clean up the precincts of the stupa by clearing away grass and weeds. Then he covered up the ground with sand and sprinkled it with water. Next, he went into the nearby woods for some wild flowers and stuck them on the wet ground. In that way, he offered his services and paid respect to the Paksabuddha who was once his son. It was because of that good deed done in that previous existence of his that the Buddha gained such benefits, that he was showered with such lavish offerings, that he was shown such deep reverence and great devotion on that particular occasion. Verse 291: Do not return hatred with hatred. He who, contaminated by his association with hatred, seeks happiness for himself by inflicting suffering on others, is not released from hatred. Story related to Dhammapada verse 291, woman who ate up the eggs of a hen. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verse 291 with reference to a feud between a woman and a hen. Once, there lived a woman in a village near Savatthi. She had a hen in her house. Every time the hen laid an egg, she would eat it up. The hen was very much hurt and angry, and made a vow to have vengeance on the woman, and made a wish that it should be reborn as some being that would be in a position to kill the offspring of that woman. The hen's wish was fulfilled as it was reborn as a cat, and the woman was reborn as a hen in the same house. The cat ate up the eggs of the hen. In their next existence, the hen became a leopard and the cat became a deer. The leopard ate up the deer as well as its offspring. Thus, the feud continued for 500 existences of the two beings. At the time of the Buddha, one of them was born as a woman and the other an ogress. On one occasion, the woman was returning from the house of her parents to her own house near Sabathi. Her husband and her young son were also with her. While they were resting near a pond at the roadside, her husband went to have a bath in the pond. At that moment, the woman saw the ogress and recognized her as her old enemy. Taking her child, she fled from the ogress straight to the Jetavana monastery, where the Buddha was expounding the Dhamma, and put her child at the feet of the Buddha. The ogress, who was in hot pursuit of the woman, also came to the door of the monastery, but the guardian spirit of the gate did not permit her to enter. The Buddha, seeing her, sent the Venerable Ananda to bring the ogress to his presence. When the ogress arrived, the Buddha reprimanded both the woman and the ogress for the long chain of feud between them. He also added, "If you two had not come to me today, your feud would have continued endlessly. Enmity cannot be appeased by enmity, it can only be appeased by loving kindness." Verse 292 to 293. Defilements multiply in the conceited. What is to be done, that is neglected; what is not to be done, that is done. Of those who are arrogant and heedless, the defilements increase. Those who diligently practice mindfulness of the body, who avoid what should not be done, and always do what should be done, the defilements of those who are mindful and clearly comprehending come to an end. Story related to Dhammapada, verse 292 to 293. Bhadiyabhikas. While residing near the town of Bhadiya, the Buddha uttered verses 292 and 293 with reference to some bhikkhus. Once, some bhikkhus who were staying in Bhadiya made some ornate slippers out of some kinds of reeds and grasses. When the Buddha was told about this, he said, "Bhikkhus, you have entered the Buddhist order for the sake of attaining arahata phala. Yet, you are now striving hard only in making slippers and decorating them." Verse 294 to 295. A saint goes on grieving. Having killed mother, i.e. craving, father, i.e. conceit, and the two kings, i.e. eternity belief and annihilation belief, and having destroyed the kingdom, i.e. the sense bases and sense objects, together with its revenue officer, i.e. attachment, the Brahmana, i.e. the arahant, goes free from dukkha. Having killed mother, father, the two Brahmin kings, and having destroyed the hindrances of which the fifth, i.e. doubt, is like a tiger-infested journey, the Brahmana, i.e. the arahant, goes free from dukkha. Story related to Dhammapada, verse 294 to 295. Therabadiya, the short one. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 294 and 295 with reference to Therabadiya, who was also known as Lakandaka Badiya because of his short stature. On one occasion, some bhikkhus came to visit and pay homage to the Buddha at the Jetavana monastery. While they were with the Buddha, Lakandaka Badiya happened to pass by not far from them. The Buddha called their attention to the short Thera and said to them, "Bhikkhus, look at that Thera. He has killed both his father and his mother, and having killed his parents, he goes about without any dukkha." The bhikkhus could not understand the statement made by the Buddha. So, they entreated the Buddha to make it clear to them, and the Buddha explained the meaning to them. In the above statement, the Buddha was referring to an arahant who had eradicated craving, conceit, wrong beliefs, and attachment to sense bases and sense objects. The Buddha had made this statement by means of metaphors. Thus, the terms mother and father are used to indicate craving and conceit respectively. The eternity belief, Sasatadithi, and annihilation belief, Akadadithi, are likened to two kings. Attachment is likened to a revenue officer, and the sense bases and sense objects, the Ajata and Bahidha Ayatanas, are likened to a kingdom. At the end of the discourse, the visiting bhikkhus attained arahatship. Verse 296 to 301. Meditate constantly. 296. Fully alert and ever vigilant are Gautama Buddha's disciples, who by day and by night are always mindful of the qualities of the Buddha. 297. Fully alert and ever vigilant are Gautama Buddha's disciples, who by day and by night are always mindful of the qualities of the Dhamma. 298. Fully alert and ever vigilant are Gautama Buddha's disciples, who by day and by night are always mindful of the qualities of the Sangha. 299. Fully alert and ever vigilant are Gautama Buddha's disciples, who by day and by night are always mindful of the component parts of the body. 300. Fully alert and ever vigilant are Gautama Buddha's disciples, whose mind by day and by night always takes delight in being compassionate. 301. Fully alert and ever vigilant are Gautama Buddha's disciples, whose mind by day and by night always takes delight in the cultivation of goodwill towards all. Story related to Dhammapada verse 296 to 301, Woodcutter's son. While residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha uttered verses 296 to 301 with reference to the son of a woodcutter. Once in Rajagaha, a woodcutter went into the woods with his son to cut some firewood. On their return home in the evening, they stopped near a cemetery to have their meal. They also took off the yoke from the 2 oxen to enable them to graze nearby, but the 2 oxen went away without being noticed by them. As soon as they discovered that the oxen were missing, the woodcutter went to look for them, leaving his son with the cart of firewood. The father entered the town, looking for his oxen. When he returned to his son, it was getting late and the city gate was closed. Therefore, the young boy had to spend the night alone underneath his cart. The woodcutter's son, though young, was always mindful and was in the habit of contemplating the unique qualities of the Buddha. That night 2 ogres came to frighten him and to harm him. When one of the ogres pulled at the leg of the boy, he cried out, "I pay homage to the Buddha, Namo Buddhassa." Hearing those words from the boy, the ogres got frightened and also felt that they must look after the boy. So, one of them remained near the boy, guarding him from all danger. The other went to the king's palace and brought the food tray of King Bimbisara. The 2 ogres then fed the boy as if he were their own son. At the palace, the ogre left a written message concerning the royal food tray, and this message was visible only to the king. In the morning, the king's men discovered that the royal food tray was missing, and they were very upset and very much frightened. The king found the message left by the ogre and directed his men where to look for it. The king's men found the royal food tray among the firewood in the cart. They also found the boy who was still sleeping underneath the cart. When questioned, the boy answered that his parents came to feed him in the night and that he went to sleep contentedly and without fear after taking his food. The boy knew only that much and nothing more. The king sent for the parents of the boy, and took the boy and his parents to the Buddha. The king, by that time, had heard that the boy was always mindful of the unique qualities of the Buddha, and also that he had cried out Namo Buddhassa when the ogre pulled at his leg in the night. The king asked the Buddha, "Is mindfulness of the unique qualities of the Buddha the only Dhamma that gives one protection against evil and danger? Or is mindfulness of the unique qualities of the Dhamma equally potent and powerful?" To him the Buddha replied, "O king, my disciple, disciple, there are 6 things, mindfulness of which is a good protection against evil and danger." At the end of the discourse the boy and his parents attained Sotapaddy fruition. Later they joined the order and eventually they became arahats.